Well, hello, everybody. Hope everybody's having a great day today. I am super excited to be with you. Thank you for the warm introductions. We said, my name's Robin Rodriguez, and I'm a solutions architect at AWS. And one of the really cool things about my job is I get to talk to people from all over the world about infrastructure as code, hear about what they're doing, share some of the things that I've learned over time. And DNS frequently comes up. My background is in infrastructure. And so some of the things that I'm going to walk you through today really are painful lessons that I've learned that I hope that you can avoid making. But I think, whether you're just beginning your Terraform journey or you're miles down that road, DNS is a fantastic place to start or continue, and look forward to sharing that with you. During the talk, I've got a little bit going on here, so probably not going to be able to keep an eye on the chat, but I will jump in there as we wrap up, and happy to talk to anybody in there, Terraform, DNS, infrastructure. We'll just see where it goes. So with that, I'm super excited to kick off this second half of HashiTalks, and let's dive right in. So like I mentioned, going to talk about a couple different things, but I'm going to start with why I think DNS makes a lot of sense to manage with Terraform. Like the introduction, I'm going to give you guys some use cases that I think Terraform really excels at, and then maybe a couple tips and tricks. I think there'll be something for everybody to pick up and learn and consider here. I think one of the first questions is, why DNS with Terraform? The best reason I come up with is DNS underpins so much of the services that we build, use, rely on. And many of us that have played in this realm know when things go wrong, they can go really wrong. And Terraform is a great way to reliably and consistently deploy DNS to our infrastructure. I think that declarative nature and syntax of Terraform maps really well to DNS. If you look on the right side of the screen, I've got two pretty simple examples there, but I bet if you're a Terraform expert that doesn't know a tremendous amount of DNS, you can reason about what's happening there. Or, if the alternative, probably where I started, if you're somebody that understands how DNS works, but are just starting your Terraform journey, I bet you can reason about what's going on in those records as well. So I think it's a great mix and allows people to really dive in. The second piece where I think Terraform really excels is its concept of a consistent state. And a consistent state is absolute must for DNS records. If you've ever dealt with an outage or a problem, inconsistent application experience for users and traced it down to one DNS server that was misconfigured compared to the rest, you know how frustrating that can be. And Terraform makes some great promises and commitments to solve those problems for us. I've already touched on it, so I'm going to gloss over, but I think it is a great way to start or expand your infrastructure as code journey. Sometimes we think of DNS as a legacy service. Maybe it's a big blue box in our data center, but we still have options, and it makes a lot of sense to get it into infrastructure as code, get it committed into source control. And finally, I'm going to hammer this home, I'm sure, throughout the presentation, but there is fantastic support for DNS across the Terraform ecosystem. So it doesn't matter if you have that big blue box in your data center, if you're all cloud native, all over the place, or you're using one of the many different commercial DNS services out there. There is Terraform support almost certainly for what you use for DNS. So that said, let's jump into some use cases. One thing that I see continually come up and is a great benefit to anyone is deploying multi-provider DNS. Earlier, I mentioned how DNS underpins so many of our services. So when we think about designing secure, reliable performance services, one of the key elements in there is making sure that we can recover from provider failures. So being able to deploy to multiple providers is a great way to mitigate provider outages across the board. It also gives you the ability to leverage unique provider features where appropriate. So I mentioned the Terraform support for so many different DNS services via providers. Well, what you can do here is mix and match where appropriate and push those records to those providers, where it makes sense. And then another really interesting use case as he comes up is individuals or organizations that need to operate multiple DNS environments, sometimes in restricted or compliant environments. So they have standardized, maybe potentially across their project or organization, on a single DNS provider or a multiple set to provide high availability, but they have an additional environment with different restrictions. They're restricted to a different type of network or a different compliant provider. And Terraform is a great mechanism to maintain consistency across these multiple providers. Now, on the right here, I've got a pretty simple example, but it really illustrates some of those concepts. So we have two variables at the top defining both the zone and what we're calling the target, the DNS ultimate record. And below that is showing we're taking three different Terraform providers and showing those same values being pushed to all three. So in this case, this customer is pushing record changes to three different providers. In this case, really gaining the best of both worlds. Maybe they're operating their data center, as well as their edge network for their customers. Okay. So another scenario that I think is really tailor-made for Terraform is maintaining consistent subdomains and records across your environment. The reality is, love it or hate it, modern services that we all operate require tons of DNS records. Many, many, many. And I challenge almost anyone out there, do you know the who, when, and why for all of the text records for your project or organization or businesses domains? And call it here, big should not be the source of truth for what type of records you have in place. Some cases where I see this come up are frequently for organizations, service providers across the technology space that support other customers that need to continually provision new accounts, for example. And on the right here, I've condensed a bit, but this is a set of some of the many Office 365 DNS records required. These are things necessary to make your team's voice calls, SPF records for secure email delivery, quite a variety. And for every domain that your organization operates, you need to deploy these. So, what Terraform gives you the opportunity to, especially as you grow into things like modules is to bake this configuration into consistent, repeatable configurations that you can stamp out one by one and have confidence that every domain is going to be provisioned correctly from the get-go. So, capturing these elements in code is a great way, again, to gain that consistency and reliability for any solution. I think back a solution like this in a previous life, an organization that I was a part of that had maybe 20 of these top level domains that ultimately needed to have this set of domain names registered for. And this was in a time before Terraform was in place. And so this required constant logging in and management via provider GUIs for DNS records. And it's kind of mind-blowing once you get accustomed to the ease at which Terraform that you can deploy these changes. So, huge additions for consistency as well as time savings across your team. So, also wanted to share a couple tips and tricks that I think, as you're considering adopting Terraform to manage your DNS, or potentially some improvements that you can make along the way. And at a high level, what you want to think about is, how can you use variables and functions, the logic built in to the HashiCorp configuration language to reduce variation across your records. We want our records to be easy to read, but we don't want to get in a habit of just cutting and pasting code down, right? So, what I want to do is illustrate a couple examples here of how we can grow the maturity and ease our operational burdens when managing DNS with Terraform. So we'll start with, on the left, I'd say a simple example. We're using the HashiCorp DNS provider to create A records for 3 different subdomains: www, API, and dev. And you can see on each one of these, they point to the same record. Maybe this is, a particular application that we've set up. Let's pretend we're a SaaS company. Every customer that signs up, we need to provision these subdomains on a special domain for them. So we have a Terraform configuration here that will do that. Now, one of the things that, if you have a keen eye, that might poke out to you is in this simple configuration, each TTL, the time to live, the duration that DNS record is considered valid is different. Now, that could be intentional. There could be good reasons for this, but frequently, this is somebody's opinion. The next person to add a record has chosen what they think is the correct value. And we can document what these should be. We can do checks to enforce it. But I believe the best solution to solve a challenge like that is to take that out of the equation for the operator to deal with. And so in our middle example, variables, you can see we've used the Terraform construct of a variable to extract the TTL, the time to live, from value out of our resources and configured in one spot. And you can see we reference that variable now throughout the resources. So if we have to add another record in there, in our example, we won't have to consider what the TTL will be. We'll use the defined default variable. Okay. Now, even building on that, we're going to, on number 3 on our right of the screen, look at what does it take to add a little bit more automation to this. And in this case, we're going to use the count function in order to iterate over that list of www API and dev subdomains. And what you can see here is created a list variable with those values. And then in the resource record, and look, first we have a count meta parameter. And then for the name value, you can see we use a count in the index and we iterate through the variables defined in that list and generate those records. Now, there is a lot of programming complexity that one could add to a record like this to say shrink it even smaller. Sometimes people say dry, don't repeat yourself. But I think this strikes a really good balance of condensing, ensuring that we're not cutting and pasting content over and over again, but at the same time, still being fairly easy to reason about somebody that may not have a tremendous amount of experience operating in this code base. So I think for every individual here listening or considering this, it's about striking that own balance with you. What's the right level of abstraction that you want to provide to manage your resources? So, sharing a couple more tips and tricks. I really think about this, providers, modules, and data sources. Oh my. But going back to one of my original and earliest statements was thinking about Terraform has an incredibly rich support for DNS services. So earlier today, as I was prepping for this talk, I did some counts on the HashiCorp website, over 20 providers that provide DNS services. And these cover all of the clouds that you might be deploying your services in, almost every DNS service that I'm familiar with. And remember I talked about you can also do this to what a lot of people think of as their legacy DNS infrastructure. And one thing that frequently surprises people is the power of HashiCorp's DNS provider itself. So this supports RFC 2136, which allows you to dynamically update DNS records. You can also add on RFC 2845 for secure key encrypted updates here. And I think this DNS provider really opens up the world for all of us looking to manage large, new and old DNS infrastructure. This is a great way to bring your Active Directory DNS servers, your bind DNS servers, your named DNS servers into your fold and get them into an infrastructure as code setup. So great. Anybody that hasn't looked into it, I'm going to touch on it a couple more times in this talk, but highly recommend you all check out the DNS provider. The second piece that it really comes down to, don't reinvent the wheel. All of us should stand on the shoulders of giants that have come before us. Let us see a little bit farther. And I think the Terraform version of that is modules. So modules give us a great opportunity to bake in our preferences, our specific configurations, and provide to our users, our peers, our coworkers, our friends working with us on projects, a simplified interface to build what they want with Terraform. When you think about DNS, there's some great examples. With a module, you could bake in your zones, make sure that any changes someone might make automatically are reflected in all of your zones. I gave an example earlier about managing the specific TTL length. This is an opportunity you could define multiple TTL lengths depending on whether this is a long-term record. Maybe this is a record as part of a move, and you're looking to manage and sort it down. Weighted records are another example. Again, abstract away some of the complicated decisions that you might have made and allow your peers to go forth and build. And I think one of the other great things, again, whether you're just starting this journey or have been doing it for years, is there are so many great modules out there to use as examples to build your own. I got some shout outs here. Minieros and Cloud Posse have made some incredibly detailed and rich modules that I think you can use potentially on their own or use as great starting and jumping off points to build. At the end of my presentation, I have some great resources, and I've also posted the slides, and we can talk about it in the chat near the end of after this presentation as well. And finally, when it comes to reinventing the wheel, and say, enrich with data sources, enrich, enrich, enrich. The DNS provider that I referenced earlier on this slide is a great example. And I say my eyes really lit up when I realized some of the capabilities here, the ability to natively within Terraform resolve DNS, use it to enrich our output. Whether we like it or not, I've certainly been conditioned. DNS names are much easier to read and parse than IP addresses that I may not deal with all the time. So adding these details in here, whether I'm checking or testing my code or just providing a richer, more complete output to take on is great. So I'd say I put an example here of a CNAME, but take a look at the DNS provider, the data sources in there. I am sure the next time you're looking at doing DNS with Terraform, you'll see some great opportunities to build on and improve the legibility of your code. And finally, here, the last piece I want to come to is, again, sometimes people consider DNS, a legacy technology, something we're stuck with. Oh, we want to go do something else. But our great opportunity here is, given the really wide support of DNS in Terraform, is what would it take for you to get your DNS configuration into source control so that you can build a pipeline or adopt your existing pipeline to be able to safely deploy DNS changes? And there are 1,000 different viable pipelines and ways that you might deploy. But I think what I want to walk us through here is some of the big milestones to think through, as you're doing this and what it ultimately ends up. And this is a great element, again, to really add some consistency and reliability to your DNS infrastructure. I'd say something that by and large people have not committed into source code. So you know what? If I've done anything, it'd be a great victory if it makes you think about it. But with this model, here is one, you want to commit your change. Say, me as a developer, I've committed a new A record, and see it here. Once I've created that pull request, let's say this is through GitHub, I have a webhook that takes me into Terraform Cloud. If you've used Terraform Cloud before, the bottom screen probably looks pretty familiar to you. You have the ability to test, run your policies, maybe you do cost estimation. But going through this, and once you've passed your tests, received your approvals, then Terraform can go ahead and deploy those changes to your infrastructure. And at that point, you've got a new record out there in the world and you're good to go. Maybe your service is up, maybe you have a new service, maybe your service is fixed. But this type of pipeline, say, bringing that to DNS is a great way to take what can be, an hours long process, down to minutes. Certainly something that I've gotten to see the power of firsthand when you can quickly add DNS records reliably. I want to highlight just a couple additional resources that I think anybody that's interested or curious about operating DNS using Terraform could learn a lot addition to reading. These are certainly some great inspirations that I've taken from. But the first two, the Canadian Digital Service and 18F, that's a digital group of the US government. Both of these organizations have developed great blueprints for operating DNS for an organization using Terraform. So I'd highly recommend anyone that's considering using Terraform for their DNS to look at the structure and the bootstrapping that these organizations use, because they really are first rate. Again, I want to reiterate the HashiCorp DNS provider, the ability to connect to, I'd say, non-API DNS providers opens up so much infrastructure for you. And then the data sources that it provides can really open your mind to a whole new world of automation. And I shouted out some great modules earlier. I've linked them in here too. There is a specific AWS Route 53 module. I think this has some great examples for how to structure your code. And then Cloud Posse, I've included a really fantastic module that they built using Cloudflare. And so I think both of those are great starting places to look at some really involved code examples for how you could go ahead and build your own infrastructure. With that, I want to thank everybody for joining and riding along. I hope that even the most seasoned of you learned or thought about DNS just a little bit. Really appreciate it. Thank you to HashiCorp for having me. And like I said, I'm going to switch over to the chat and hope to talk to you all over there. So thank you guys very much and have a great rest of your HashiTalk experience.